Hi, my name is Patrick Miller, and this channel is intended to be a place where I discuss philosophical theories and the way that they relate to our world today. This is my first video essay, so I ask that you forgive the pauses and skips, distracting as they may be, and I hope that you learn something worth your time. Thank you for watching. On November 11th, 2022, FTX, one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world, filed for bankruptcy, along with dozens of its subsidiary companies. FTX was touted as a safe, legitimate space where one could enter into the world of cryptocurrency banking. They had multiple prominent commercials featuring celebrities like Larry David, Tom Brady, and Shaq. Before their filing, they boasted over $32 billion in assets. What happened? While proponents of the cryptocurrency market have claimed that it would bring about a decentralized, egalitarian paradigm for the financial industry, what happened at FTX appears to have been a tale as old as Wall Street itself. In what many, including now the CFTC and the Southern District of New York's U.S. Attorney's Office, have deemed to be embezzlement and a Ponzi scheme, Sam Bankman-Fried, the CEO of FTX, attempted to use Alameda Research, an investment firm that he ran covertly on the side, as a means of recouping losses on his business model for FTX. He was accomplishing this by using his in-house cryptocurrency, FTX token, as a marker of exchange for the sharing of funds between the two entities. Essentially, Alameda was making speculative bets on various emerging cryptocurrencies using funds that were borrowed from FTX customers in exchange for FTX tokens. These customers were not notified that their funds were being liquidated in exchange for FTX token, and when a ledger sheet for FTX was reported on by CoinDesk on November the 2nd, it was revealed that they had only around $900 million in liquid assets, a surprisingly small sum for a supposedly $32 billion company. This remaining sum was mostly composed of Robinhood shares, which Bankman-Fried was in the process of frantically selling off at a reduced rate. Now, this story could be viewed as just another cautionary tale in the long line of mishaps that have plagued the cryptocurrency market since its conception. But there's an interesting wrinkle in Bankman-Fried's ostensible motivations that I believe speaks to major issues within a philosophical school that is achieving influence in modern Western ethical thought. Sam Bankman-Fried was a member of the Effective Altruism community, a well-known philanthropic movement centered around a concept that they call earning to give. It is difficult to overstate the influence that effective altruism has had, particularly among liberal intelligentsia and business magnates. The philosophy of EA and associated organizations have been endorsed and funded by the likes of Bill Gates, Dustin Moskovitz, Sam Harris, and Nick Bostrom, among others. Unlike traditional charities, which rely on a large volume of small contributions from everyday citizens, many EA donors have been high-profile billionaires with huge amounts of disposable income. Indeed, at the time of FTX's collapse, the FTX Futures Fund, a charitable organization under FTX's corporate umbrella, had pledged over $1 billion in donations to various causes, many of which were linked directly to the effective altruism community. Now, while Sam Bankman-Fried's relationship with the effective altruism community has not been without controversy, he was still a very prominent and central public face for the philosophy. In numerous podcast appearances and interviews, he has endorsed EA, including one where he ambitiously claimed to be planning to eventually give 99% of his wealth to charity. But his own personal commitment to the philosophy now appears to be dubious at best. He is on record in an interview with Vox, conducted in November of 2022 after the crash of FTX, stating that, regarding his public commitment to ethical stances, quote, "We woke Westerners play this dumb game where we say all the right shibboleths and so everyone likes us." Now, clearly, the purpose of this essay is not to argue that Sam Bankman-Fried was motivated at all times by a genuine commitment to effective altruism. Rather, we will examine the implications of the way that his actions prior to the crash were regarded by the EA community as permissible, even in the face of mounting evidence of various ethically dubious choices and breaches of trust. In 2018, a large number of the employees at Alameda Research resigned over alleged ethical concerns. SBF claimed that this was due to personal disputes and a lack of productivity. But according to a source close to the matter, quote, "The majority of staff at Alameda were unhappy with Sam's leadership of the company. Their concerns about Sam included concerns about him taking extreme and unnecessary risks and losing large amounts of money, poor safeguards around moving money around, and poor capital controls, including a lack of distinction between money owned by investors and money owned by Alameda itself. Also, Sam generally being extremely difficult to work with." Now, one would think that resignations of this magnitude would trigger at least some form of investigation within a community so dedicated to ethicality and transparency. However, despite many alarm bells, the EA leadership, including its founder, Will MacAskill, who were responsible for the rubber stamping that SBF had received up to this point, remained firm in their endorsement. Some concerns were expressed within the community regarding the possibility that SBF might present a possible future PR difficulty, but shockingly little action was taken in light of the emerging evidence. An influential member of the EA community reflected in an online forum, "I think the vast majority of EAs had little they could have or should have done here, but I think that I and a number of people in the EA leadership had the ability to actually do something about this. I sent emails in which I warned people of SBF. I had sat down my whole team, swore them to secrecy, and told them various pretty clearly illegal things that I had heard Sam had done. Parentheses, sadly all unconfirmed at the time, asking for confidentiality and only in rumors. That convinced me that we should avoid doing business with him as much as possible." There was also an interview with Matt Levine of Bloomberg back in April of 2022, where Bankman-Fried literally argued in favor of using what appeared to be a cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme in order to make money.
You know, where'd you start? You start with a company that builds a box. And in practice, this box, they probably dress it up to look like a life-changing, world-altering protocol that's going to replace all the big banks in 38 days or whatever. Maybe for now, actually ignore what it does or pretend it does literally nothing. It's just a box. And then this protocol issues a token. We'll call it whatever, X token. And X token promises that anything cool that happens because of this box is going to ultimately be usable by, governance vote of holders of the X tokens. They can vote on what to do with any proceeds or other cool things that happen from this box. And of course, so far we haven't exactly given a compelling reason for why there ever would be any proceeds from this box, but I don't know, maybe there will be. So that's sort of where you start. And now what happens? Well, X token has some market cap, right? It's probably not zero. Let's say it's, $20 million market cap, and a bunch of arbitrageurs.
By the way, from like first principles, it should be zero, but okay.
Sure. Okay. I completely reasonable comment.
That's not quite true, but it when you describe it in this totally cynical way, it sounds like it should be zero, but go on.
Describe it this way. You might think, for instance, that in 5 minutes with an internet connection, you could create such a box and such a token, and that it should reflect it should be worth $180 or something market cap for that, that effort that you put into it. In the world that we're in, if you do this, everyone's going to be like, ooh, box token. Maybe it's cool. If you bought any box token, that's going to appear on Twitter and it'll have a $20 million market cap. So, sophisticated traders and or people on crypto Twitter or other sort of similar parties go and put $200 million in the box collectively, and they start getting these X tokens for it, right? And now all of a sudden everyone's like, wow, people just decide to put $200 million in the box. This is a pretty cool box, right? This is a valuable box, as demonstrated by all the money that people have apparently decided should be in the box. And who are we to say that they're wrong about that? This is, I mean, boxes can be great. Look, I love boxes as much as the next guy, right? And so what happens now, all of a sudden people are kind of recalibrating. It's like, well, $20 million, that's it? That market cap for this box, and it's been 48 hours and it already has $200 million, including from sophisticated players in it.
I think of myself as a fairly cynical person, and that was so much more cynical than how I would have described farming. You're just well, I'm in the Ponzi business and it's pretty good.
At no point did any of this require any sort of economic case. It's just other people put money in the box, and so I'm going to too, and then it's more valuable, so I'm going to put more money in. And at no point in the cycle did it seem to like describe any sort of like economic purpose.
So on the one hand, I think that's a pretty reasonable response, but let me play around with this a little bit, right? Because that's one framing of this, and I think there's like a sort of depressing amount of validity.
Can you comment on like the sustainability of that? Like,
yeah,
because like, you know, on the one hand, you're like, well, $1 trillion of institutional money is going to come into Bitcoin. On the other hand, you're like, basically, there are a lot of Ponzi's that have done really well.
Right. So okay, cool. I'll stay on the cynical route. Think about like cynically what could happen here. Well, okay, so you've got this box is kind of dumb, but like what's the end game, right? This box is worth 0, obviously, and like that, you know, you can't like keep this market cap or something. But on the other hand, if everyone kind of now thinks that this box token is worth about $1 billion market cap, that's what people are pricing it at, and it sort of has that market cap. Everyone's going to market to market. In fact, you can even finance this, right? You can put X token in a borrow lending protocol and borrow dollars with it. If you think it's worth like less than 2/3 of that, you could even just like put some in there, take the dollars out, and never give the dollars back. You just get liquidated eventually. And it is sort of like real monetizable stuff in some senses. And you know, at some point, like if the world never decides that we were wrong about this in like a coordinated way, right? Like you're kind of the guy calling bullshit and saying, no, this thing's actually worthless. But in what sense are you right?
Can I just ask on this point? I mean, so are you saying that the value has to derive from everyone agreeing that it's worth something? And I know, like, on the one hand, that seems like a simple point about crypto, but on the other hand, throughout crypto's history, there have been these different arguments about how it actually gets value, you know, use cases for the underlying technology, for blockchain. Everyone's going to start migrating stuff on blockchain, and then you're going to have a real economic use attached to these assets, and that's where the value is going to come from. But are you saying that it depends more on everyone just agreeing that these are worth something?
So really what I'd say is that it could come in theory from either. You can sort of get a market cap either because of cash flow, right? And then like Warren Buffett's like, fuck this, like I'm going to buy this if it's at too cheap of a price, because I'll just buy it and own it and get cash flow from it, and that's great. Or you could see something get market cap in the way that, I don't know, Dogecoin or Shibcoin have, right? Where people are just kind of like, haha, and then they buy it. And if you're like, that's dumb, it has no cash flow, I'm going to short sell it, you lose all your money.
As you can see, it's quite astonishing how openly and glibly Sam would talk about these problematic methods. It seems to belie a kind of modernist arrogance, a sense that what he and others were doing in the emerging crypto market was somehow exempt from the antiquated rules and principles of the financial industry. He appeared to believe that a Ponzi scheme could actually work, provided it was composed of a complicated enough string of ones and zeros. Both of the altcoins he mentioned in that video, by the way, Dogecoin and Shibcoin, have cratered spectacularly in the past year. So the question must be asked, how did Sam Bankman-Fried come to be involved with effective altruism in the first place? It started back in 2013 when Will MacAskill, then an Oxford philosophy PhD student, had a meeting over lunch with a young SBF, then aged just 21. Sam was a physics major at MIT, but he just interned with Jane Street, a trading shop in New York's financial district, where many up-and-coming Wall Street investors had been earning their chops. They talked about a new branch of utilitarian ethics which Will had been instrumental in developing, called effective altruism. It took the standard line in utilitarian ethical theories of maximizing the greatest good for the largest amount of people, with a few important addendums. Namely, it urged making the good we achieve for others effective by recruiting those who are already earning money via orthodox capitalist means, and then encouraging them to donate as much as possible of their income to charity. As a promising up-and-coming investor and MIT graduate, Sam was the perfect recruit for Will's burgeoning philosophical movement. Secondly, it placed a great deal of emphasis on the responsibility we have towards future lives. It argued that the amount of experiences in the future is possibly infinite, and is certainly orders of magnitude greater than the number of experiences in the world at the current moment. This particular aspect of his philosophy seems to have left a considerable impression on SBF, for good or for ill. SBF frequently talked in his interviews about the portion of his donations that were directed towards future-oriented projects like pandemic preparedness and sustainable agriculture and energy. FTX's charitable foundation is, of course, also literally called the FTX Futures Fund. Now, while the question of whether Sam was a true believer or merely using the moralistic language of EA expediently seems to be largely settled, the concerns I have outlined regarding the wider community's supportive response seem to me to make a deeper dive into the underlying philosophy worth attempting. Will MacAskill is a utilitarian moral philosopher. Early in his academic career, he read Peter Singer, who is inarguably one of the most, if not the most, influential utilitarian philosophers in modern times. MacAskill found Singer's arguments regarding moral necessity quite convincing. Singer famously uses the example of encountering a drowning child in a lake to outline a circumstance that presents us with a moral necessity. In this case, to fail to help the child seems to constitute as much of a moral action as actively killing them. He then argues that, given that we have the ability today to give money to international charities, we ought to feel the same degree of responsibility for all of the suffering that is being experienced around the world. The child starving in Africa is just as deserving of our compassion as the child drowning in the lake next to us. Singer grounds his case for moral necessity in the principle of utility. Essentially, this principle proceeds as follows. While we may have 5 different senses with which to experience the world, human experience itself can be fundamentally divided into 2 categories, pleasure and pain. We approve or disapprove of actions based on the quantitative amount of pleasure or pain they bring about. And it is from this derivation that we can and should, Singer argues, construct our ethics, or our conceptions of good and evil. Using this heuristic, we can infer that actions which lead to the greatest amount of pleasure or utility, quote, are the most good and therefore most ethically preferable actions to take. The English philosopher Jeremy Bentham is regarded as the father of utilitarianism, and it's to him that the principle of utility is most often attributed. However, he was strongly influenced in his views by the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume and the empiricist tradition. The principle of utility can be regarded as a straightforwardly empiricist doctrine. In a nutshell, empiricism claims that human minds are a blank slate, and everything that makes us what we are is received from the 5 senses that deliver information regarding the external world. What Bentham provided was a formulation for how this idea could have implications for the governance of society and the regulation of cultural norms. He argued that this basic determination of minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure could provide guidance for what kind of laws we should enact, and that satisfying this objective was and ought to remain the primary purpose of society. However, what Bentham in large part glossed over, and what later utilitarians, including John Stuart Mill, tried to reconcile, is the leap of logic that is required to understand how we can get from self-interested ethical motivation to other-centered ethical motivation. There is something called the demandingness objection to the principle of utility, which basically states that many of the acts that utilitarianism demands of us, especially those done for the community or for the greater good, quote-unquote, fall under the category of supererogatory, or things that are considered praiseworthy but not obligatory. Essentially, the point is made that people everywhere seem to act on the basis of maximizing their own pleasure, often at the expense of others' suffering. We expect nothing less in society, but when someone does something for the good of somebody else, we praise them. Utilitarianism demands of us that we act for the good of others as a moral necessity. The question is asked, how do we then get from an understanding of the good as a personal pleasure and personal reduction of suffering to an understanding of the good as the community's pleasure and the community's reduction of suffering? This problem is one that is far from settled in the utilitarian philosophical tradition, and there is a storied history regarding its negotiation by several of utilitarianism's most revered voices. Some, including Scottish judge and philosopher Sir James Mackintosh, tried to argue that we get our motivation to do things for the good of society from an aspect of our psychology that associates a felt sense of, quote, good with any action that alleviates suffering. This associated sense might be initially trained on self-interested actions, but it can be easily directed towards actions done for the happiness of others because of the resemblance their experience bears to our own. J.S. Mill's father, James Mill, himself a prominent utilitarian philosopher, launched a strong attack against Mackintosh's use of associationist psychology. He argued that any felt sense of good was superfluous to our rational faculty, which ought to be sufficient for making moral judgments. Mill was a strict adherent of Bentham's empiricist framework, and he felt that introducing extra senses was an unnecessary violation of his epistemology. Under empiricism, the only senses we have are the 5 which give us information about the external world. To Bentham, the good, happiness, or utility, is merely the sum total of all our pleasurable experiences. It's a simple matter of arithmetical calculus to understand how individuals pursuing happiness will thereby contribute to the greater good. Will they not naturally want to create a society in which it is easier to attain more pleasure and prevent more pain? But this appears to be a strikingly naive position, unless one assumes an inherently socially minded aspect to human nature. This was an idea which Bentham was understandably reticent to comment upon, given his empiricist commitments and the blank slate that they entail. John Stuart Mill, arguably the second most famous utilitarian after Bentham himself, also understood the problem faced by utilitarianism in regards to community-minded action. He acknowledged that in order to cooperate with one another, human beings have an inherent need to be aiming at something more than the maximization of a narrow experiential category like pleasure. For if that were the case, we might simply install a benevolent despot who would ensure that bread and circuses were always plentiful. Bentham objected to monarchy and promoted democracy out of the rightful yet rudimentary concern that monarchs can far too easily put their own pleasure ahead of everybody else's. Mill, on the other hand, felt that a liberal democracy was necessary in order that a society might be constructed where the free development of the individual is fostered. The nature of what that development might be, however, was dubious in its adherence to a strictly Benthamite empiricist account. Indeed, when Mill concluded that, quote, "the end of man is the highest and most harmonious development of his powers to a complete and consistent whole," in his work on Liberty, page 54, it would seem that he had wandered far afield from the simple axis of revulsion from pain and desire for pleasure. Aspects of Mill's ethics have been regarded by some as resembling a return to Aristotelian virtue ethics, albeit not openly acknowledged as such. Historian of philosophy Frederick Cobblestone notes in his chapter on J.S. Mill in A History of Philosophy that, quote, "Mill sees, as Aristotle saw, that the exercise of human activities cannot properly be described as the means to an end, happiness, when that end is taken to be something purely external to those activities. For the exercise of the activities can itself constitute a part of happiness, and not simply a means to some abstract external end. Happiness is not an abstract idea, but a concrete whole. This is a thoroughly Aristotelian notion." End quote. This analysis, if correct, presents a striking contradiction between Mill's conception of utility and a proper Benthamite utilitarianism, with its discrete abstractions, the quote, "units of happiness," or so-called utils, as they are fondly referred to in some modern utilitarian circles. It could also be argued that Mill was attempting to salvage utilitarian ethics from the onslaught of Immanuel Kant's idealism. Kant was widely regarded as having provided a resounding rebuttal to Humean empiricism with his critique of pure reason. He argued with his categorical imperative that ethical actions can only ever be those which treat other human beings as ends in themselves, and not means to an end. The Benthamist abstraction of utility as the goal of society could be said to allow for some distance between the bearers of utility, human beings, and the good of utility itself. The classic thought experiment that is meant to illustrate the principle of utilitarianism is of course the trolley car problem, where the good utilitarian will always kill the one individual for the good of the many. This ethic, however, when applied to various scenarios, appears to fall apart in the face of most people's moral intuitions. For example, people are generally opposed to the idea of taking organs from an unconscious patient in order to save other patients on a transplant list. We seem to have intuitions about the importance of respecting people as holistic individual beings, along with the rights which that respect affords. This value for the integrity of the individual would seem to be in part due to the influence that Kantian ethics have had on the Western mind, although the natural law tradition should certainly be mentioned as well. The only way that we can justify actions that take advantage of people living today for some future abstraction of the greater good is by using just that, an abstraction. Mill saw that Bentham's abstract concept of utility was far from being a goal that would edify society, but in doing so, he was forced to stray away from the fundamental epistemic claims of utilitarianism. So you're probably asking, how does all of this relate to Sam Bankman-Fried and effective altruism? My concern is that J.S. Mill's departure from the strict Benthamism of his father and others serves as a kind of Mott and Bailey for the EA community. For those unfamiliar, the Mott and Bailey referred to a common rhetorical fallacy. Mott and Bailey in Old English referred to a field and a castle. Sometimes when someone is holding a position that seems indefensible, they will retreat to a similar but more moderate version of it when questioned, just like soldiers would retreat from the field into their castle. When effective altruists are in the Mott, or in the field, they're not above justifying less than perfect means for acquiring future goods, due to the useful fact that they're in possession of a concrete method of calculating out the general good. That's the only conceivable explanation for how an altruist can find themselves in an alliance with someone who will make risky investments using other people's stolen money. However, when confronted by liberal values and norms, they can of course pay their respects to Mill's disguised Aristotelian notion of humans as holistic beings whose individual development is the goal of a free society. In response to the FTX crisis, Will MacAskill has said, quote, "A clear-thinking EA should strongly oppose ends justify the means reasoning." However, as I hope to have at least partially illustrated here, there isn't actually a strong foundation in the utilitarian tradition for a clear-thinking, effective altruist to do anything of the sort. So, where does that leave us as a society in terms of ethical systems on offer? Some have contended that, despite its flaws, we should be happy that effective altruism offers a popular, modern, and accessible moral system that accomplishes a lot of good in the world. To that I would respond that there are many superior options on offer. For the more metaphysically adventurous, idealism, especially Kantian and Hegelian ethics, offer a way of engaging with subjectivity that has strong moral implications. Phenomenology, specifically Emmanuel Levinas and his response to Heideggerian philosophy in the wake of the Second World War, also draws on intersubjectivity in its ethical discourse on what we owe to the other. There is the natural law route, which has been a strong force for positive social change in Western society, influencing not only anti-slavery movements in England and America, but of course the founding documents of the American nation, which paved the way for modern democracy. It is not by accident that Mill himself appears to be appealing to Aristotelian notions of virtue in his effort to preserve utilitarianism from one of its most glaring faults. So, to the effective altruists I say, let us not fall prey, like Sam Bankman-Fried, to the shining glitter of the new, that now pervasive modernist fallacy which tells us that all the best human discoveries were invented within the last week. For, as the old saying tells us, all that glitters is not gold. Thank you for your time.